Part 3, The Watcher. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands trembled uncontrollably. The box, with its grotesque glass eye, sat on the passenger seat like a malevolent passenger. The dark stain it left on my jacket had dried into an oily smear that refused to rub off. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I drove away, the house loomed in my rearview mirror, a black silhouette against the sky. But it didn't feel distant. It felt closer, as if it had followed me. I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror, expecting to see something in the back seat. A shape, a shadow, something. The diary sat beside the box, its cracked leather cover marred by that same eye symbol. Every time my gaze flicked to it, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to touch it again, but the questions it held were unbearable. What had Edgar Crane done? What had he awakened in that cursed house? My phone buzzed on the dashboard, the sudden noise making me flinch so hard I nearly swerved off the road. A message from my friend Lisa lit up the screen. "You good? Been hours since you said you'd check in." I realized with a start that I'd been inside that house for far longer than it felt. The sun had dipped below the horizon. Night had fully settled. I hesitated before replying. "I'm fine, just needed air. We'll talk later." It was a lie, of course. I wasn't fine. And deep down, I didn't want to talk to Lisa or anyone else. Some primal instinct told me to keep the events of the night to myself. If I told her, if I told anyone, it would make this real. But it was real. The glass eye glinted faintly under the dashboard light, almost as if it were alive. I could feel its gaze, piercing even without a pupil. And I had the unsettling thought that it wasn't the glass eye looking at me. It was something through the eye, watching from another place, the drive. The road stretched endlessly before me, empty and dark. Each streetlight I passed seemed to flicker as if struggling to stay alive. A faint hum filled the air, too soft to pinpoint but loud enough to keep me on edge. Then I noticed it. The shadows along the road, they were wrong. At first it was subtle. The shapes cast by the trees and telephone poles seemed to twitch unnaturally, just at the edge of my vision. But as I drove farther, they began to stretch and shift. One shadow extended across the road like a hand reaching for the car. Another darted between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be human. I pressed the accelerator, my foot heavy. The car sped down the winding road, but the shadows kept pace. They began to converge, merging into larger, darker forms. My headlights seemed to dim, swallowed by the growing blackness. And then, just ahead, standing directly in the middle of the road, was a figure. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere feet from the shape. My headlights illuminated it, but the light didn't seem to touch it. The figure was tall and cloaked in shadow, its edges blurring as though it wasn't entirely there. For a moment, we were both still. Then it raised its hand, pointing directly at me. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to drive. But I couldn't move. The figure tilted its head, and I realized that, despite its lack of a face, it was looking at the box. The glass eye began to glow faintly, casting an eerie green light that filled the car. The figure took a step forward. The spell broke, and I stomped on the gas. The car lunged forward, passing through the figure, which dissolved into a mist that wrapped around the vehicle. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and for a moment, I thought the car would stall. But then the mist cleared and the road ahead was empty. The motel. I couldn't go home, not yet. Whatever I'd disturbed, I wasn't about to lead it back to my apartment. Instead, I checked into a dingy roadside motel. The clerk barely looked up as I handed over cash, my hands still trembling. The room was as grim as I expected, stained carpet, flickering lights, a faint smell of mildew. But it had locks, and that was all I needed. I placed the box on the desk, its presence dominating the small room. The glass eye stared back at me, unblinking, unrelenting. The diary lay beside it, still open to the page about the vessel. What is the vessel? The words echoed in my mind as I flipped through the pages, skimming for anything that made sense. Edgar's notes grew more fragmented, his descriptions descending into madness. He wrote about visitors to the house, people who disappeared after seeing it. He spoke of sacrifices, bargains made in blood, and a doorway to something he called the between. One entry stopped me cold. March 1st, 1912. The eye must remain in its box. To hold it too long is to invite their gaze. They will come for it and for whoever holds it. But I cannot let it go. Without the eye, I am blind to them, and they will take me. God help anyone who finds this diary, for they are already doomed. A cold dread settled over me. The box shifted slightly as if reacting to my fear. Then came the knock on the door. 3 soft raps. I froze. No one knew I was here. "Who is it?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the box and backed away from the door. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Shadows pooled in the corners, darker than they should have been. The knock came a third time, followed by a whisper. "You cannot run." I clutched the box tighter as the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and from the shadows, something began to move.